And we decided that, it's hard, if you really are focused on your science and your research, it's hard to really understand the process, but you can learn how to navigate through the process effectively. So what I'm going to do in the next few minutes is give you a few tips on how to navigate in this environment as an effective advocate. So the first thing is, it is true that all politics really are local. And when I worked on the Hill, we would answer every piece of mail that came in from constituents. But if a letter came from a national association, if it came from some other state, or even from Michigan, but not from our district, we didn't necessarily answer it. A lot of them ended up in a wastebasket pretty quickly because we had enough mail just to deal with the constituents. And at the end of the day, it was the constituents who voted for my boss. And he was a populist, so he voted based, even if he had his own views that differed from what his constituents believed, he would vote with the constituents. So mail mattered. So it is truly local, and that's why, in some sense, sometimes our universities will say, well, the association should weigh in, and that we're not going to. And we say, well, that probably doesn't make sense, because just like I said, when letters from AAU might have came into my office and we didn't pay that much attention to them, but if the University of Michigan or Michigan State University, who were our flagship universities in Michigan, wrote us, that was something we paid attention to. It has a lot more impact to come from that more local or state level. So it really is important to recognize that. The other thing that I often say is all politics is personal. And that's why to be an effective advocate is really important. And this is something that scientists and engineers have a hard time doing, because you're taught to really distance yourself from the emotional piece of what you do and why you do it. Although it is interesting, some of you may have heard that Stony Brook has a very innovative program that was started by actor Alan Alda in communicating science, and they're teaching improvisation to scientists and engineers, graduate students. So they get up, and I've seen the videos, fascinating, they say, talk about why your research is important. And so they get up and they give real technical examples, and then Alda said, no. Why does it matter to you? Why does it really matter? And give it, personalize it, because it's that really hits the chord with the public, and especially as they don't understand what you're talking about. So I think there's something to be said about making that personal connection, and when you're talking to people who aren't familiar with the technical piece of things, you really do have to explain, why does it matter to you? Why do you do this in the beginning? And what do you think you're going to accomplish with it at the end of the day, versus getting into the pieces that people like I or politicians are going to understand. Your colleagues will appreciate those, but they won't. And personalizing also means, again, why does it matter to you? Used to be, I go to this reception every year that was put on by the magnetic fusion community, and John Myers, who was then the chair of the corporations, would say, I want to know why, what I tell the senior citizen who comes in asking about Social Security, why I'm funding this program. I need to know why it matters. And so we spent a lot of time at AAU trying to tell stories about how basic research and things that you didn't realize affect your daily lives. The thing that we have on the website now is everybody has one of these devices, right? And I think that Steve Jobs created it, but really Steve Jobs put a lot of pieces together that have been funded, research done, the touch screen done at the University of Delaware, other things done by university researchers, and then it was federally funded, by the way. So it's explaining that, and so this is the automobile, and you see all these different things that ultimately have roots back to federally funded research, whether it be the rear brake light in the middle brake light that was added based upon Department of Transportation studies that showed there were less accidents in New York taxi cabs if you had that brake light included, or the tire treads, or the shatterproof windshields, which were based upon neutron scattering research done by the Department of Energy at its labs. So other things, if you look at the things that are used in the battlefield by our soldiers, There are a number of things. So we've done this graphic, and we have a number of other things that walk through this. But it's just important when you communicate to think about what is it that will connect and that they can relate to. So the automobile one, we have a car dealer in Congress. That's something that's the graphic we take to him. Or somebody on the Armed Services Committee, this would be something that would be matter to them. And it's also the place where they have most ability to affect research. Build a relationship. And that's really important. It shouldn't be just going in and asking for things when you need them. And that has to be one of trust. It has to be mutually beneficial. What do I mean by that? I often use an example that Debbie Stabenow, who's in the U.S. Senate now from Michigan, when I worked on the Hill, she would lead a letter to get money for a program called the Space Grant Program. Anybody familiar with Space Grant? It funds space research, a lot of undergraduate programs at space grant universities. And she would lead that letter, and the university and the folks who benefited and would ask her to do that at the University of Michigan would also sponsor a space day where they would invite her constituents to come and bring their children and launch rockets and learn some about space. But they let Debbie Stabenow, then a representative in the U.S. House, sponsor that day. So she would get the credit, they would do the work, but that was beneficial. What it showed is she cared about education, she cared about teaching kids science, and it was beneficial because she also then proved that by going to Congress and working for it every day. It gave her visibility. So that's what I mean by think about, and what I'd say is, oftentimes, I and my colleagues will say, you need to, when you go in, don't waste staff members' time, have an ask. And that's true, but it shouldn't always be about an ask. It's also about offering to help and thinking about what skills you have that you might be able to help or serve as a resource, or people you know who might be able to serve as a resource. And I would say, if there's one thing I learned, and I was really lucky that I ended up working at MIT at a time that the president was Chuck Vest. He was an engineer, and he was committed to coming to Washington. And one thing I learned from Charles Vest was it's important to listen, not always talk. And he scheduled a day, and I'll tell you, to get presidents of universities to come to Washington, commit they're going to come to Washington once a month, which is what he did, unscheduled, just because it was important for him to be there. And then we would schedule visits for him, and he would go, and he'd often ask questions like, what do you need? We have faculty, we can help, what's on your mind, how can we help? And I think that's something we often take for granted. A lot of senior administrators from universities only come to Washington when they want to ask something or ask for something, and that's probably not the best way. Relationships are really important when it comes, because remember, it's personal, and it's about relationships. That's what politics really is. So it's important to build those relationships and not just show up once a year on the lobby day that's organized, but try and keep in touch. Speak their language, not yours. What do I mean? Well, language is really important, and oftentimes, as we've already discussed, there's two different languages. So I often like to cite Michael Faraday, of course, who was a pioneer in the field of electricity. He was speaking before the British Royal Society about his new invention, the dynamo, which was a precursor to the electric generator. And this young politician, William Gladstone, was getting bored with the talk because it was very technical. And he stood up and said, I'm sure this is all very interesting, Mr. Faraday, but what on God's good is it? And to talk about the language difference, and I think Faraday understood that, he responded, someday you politicians will be able to tax it. So that mattered to the politicians, and he realized that what really didn't matter was all the technical speak that he was doing, so he put it in their terms, and that's an important thing. Remember, oftentimes it is not easy for scientists to do this because they just don't know the other language. And so you see this, but language really does matter. And it matters even for people like me, and sometimes we even take things for granted. So I like to point to the fact that a few years back, there was some polling done and some analysis with focus groups that showed that actually you got higher positives if you talked about university research than you did if you talked about basic research, or you talked about fundamental research. that people just connected. They know what a university is. In fact, more recent research has even revealed there's another problem with using the word basic research with the general public. Focus group done a few years ago found that when you said, should the government support basic research? The response from the focus groups was, why would we be supporting basic research when we should be supporting really tough, difficult research? So, and you can see if you really never worked in a research environment, yeah, that might be what you think basic research is. It's pretty simple. So sometimes we need to think about that different language and really try and make sure we're connected. Now the other thing I say is, but don't pretend to be a native. What do I mean? Don't be overly political. You're scientists, you're researchers. Be who you are. Try and understand, what you need to do to make a convincing argument, but don't try to be a politician. And there have been some faculty and others that have taken up to the Hill who drive me nuts because they act like they're snake oil. They act like they're the lobbyists on K Street you always hear about. And that's really not the way to be effective. Know when to talk. There's nothing more troubling than getting a letter when I was on the Hill asking for my boss to vote for a bill the week after the vote occurred. So it is really important to know the right time to deliver a message and what's going on and when the appropriations process, when the funding process is happening. And then know to whom you're speaking about. I'll talk a little bit about this more, but it's so important to know your audience. For example, if you're advocating for medical research, the fact that somebody had a family member who died of cancer, and they're a big advocate, knowing that might be helpful. Or again, the car salesman, right? I mean, know a little bit about their history, read their bios, try and find out about them. So the other thing I say though is so putting this context of traveling to a foreign country, I often say that while maps are good while you're there, why not employ a tour guide? Who are potential tour guides that can help you? So I start with your university government relations officers, people who are doing this, and you'll hear from some of them here on the panel that that's what their job is. And I can tell you, having been one of those people, I would prefer that you let me know you're going to have a conversation with a state legislator or a federal legislator, as opposed to getting a call afterwards that says so-and-so was just in my office. They were saying that the university really cares about that. What do you think? And I say, well, I've never heard of that program. It would be nice to know. Even if you're students, the fact you're going to do this, they give you a lot of help, and they can tell you exactly what I said. They know those members. They have relationships with the staff. They may even know the staff that went to the university or have relationships. But scientific societies, many of you are members of societies, or if you want, I encourage you to be involved. They have government relations offices that are looking for people that want to be advocates. They need those people to come to Washington. They often have fly-in days, and they're also great resources. And the last thing is that the staff themselves are often the most important people. So they can, if you build a relationship with the staffer who does the science or the health or the energy issues, depending on what your interest is in affecting policy, that person can tell you when there's a vote. And if they see you as a resource, they'll even pick up the phone and say, maybe I'll call so-and-so because the congressman, he's trying to make up his mind and I can get some information. So that's where the relationship comes in. And they can be great tour guides and help you understand how to navigate through the process. And there's personal staff, like I was. There's committee staff. They are much more specialist. And the other thing I often say is don't forget the local staff, the staff who are in the district. I said all politics is local. One thing I often say is it's fascinating to me, the fact that when I worked on the Hill, there would be all these people flying out to Washington from the district to see my boss, when in fact he was in the district as much as he was in Washington. And some of my best conversations were when he was sitting in his district office, relaxed. He wasn't running to a committee hearing, wasn't supposed to be in 5 places at once. So sometimes getting them back home is more effective. You don't have to come to Washington because, again, they'd rather come to the lab. They'd rather see what you're doing. Invite them to campus, although tell your government relations person you're doing that, because there's also nothing worse than having a member of Congress show up without the right people knowing. But it is useful to do. So I want to kind of conclude with why we need more people in policy backgrounds, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about just the context in which we're dealing with Washington, because I think it's always useful to understand some of the dynamics. So, well, I've already kind of emphasized this. We don't have a lot of policymakers that understand science. So it's important for folks with scientific backgrounds to engage. It's important for them to even take time to, if possible, go and spend a stint. And I'm a big advocate of the AAAS Science Policy Fellows Program, which puts people with PhDs on Capitol Hill for a year, actually working in congressional offices, sponsored by their scientific societies, and also in key federal agencies. It's a great program. If you're, and I'd encourage all of those of you who are interested, that is a wonderful way to get exposed to the policy world. Let me talk a little bit about members of Congress, because I think it's important to know that, first of all, and we're still waiting, getting some data on the new Congress, but it's important to know that it used to be we complained about members and how long they'd been there. That is not the truth anymore. The turnover in Congress has been significant. So the 113th Congress, which just concluded, was ruled the most inexperienced Congress ever. One of the most inexperienced. And why is that? Well, 2 out of the 5 members, when the 113th Congress came in, had served for less than 3 years at the start of that Congress. And we got similar trends. I'll be interested to look at this data for this Congress. The Senate, we've seen a 43% turnover since 2008. The other thing, and this is going to be important when I talk about some of the dynamics right now we're dealing with, is that we've created a number of safe districts. So the number, in 1992, the number of members elected from what we call swing districts, where the margin of victory for the presidential candidates, the Republican and the Democrat, was less than 5%, was over 100, it was 103. In the last presidential election, 2012, it was down to 35. What does that mean? That means that it's getting harder and harder to elect moderates. It's getting harder and harder in districts where there's real competition between the Democrat and Republican. It's usually the primaries that matter. Now, for science, that creates a problem, because I often say moderates are the ones who are most willing to take into account that evidence to change their views. And when you start electing ideologues, science gets squeezed out. And so this explains some of the dynamics, which we can talk about. But it's important to note that. And then right now, we've got a number of new members, so this just shows they're new. Now, the other thing to talk about when we talk about members of Congress, and if you think it's bad at the federal level, look at state legislators in terms of their understanding of science and look at their educational backgrounds. So let's just talk about Congress. Less than 5% have any background in science or engineering. There are, by the way, in this Congress, 1.5 physicists. Now, why do I say 1.5? So 1 has a PhD. We did hit a max where there were 3. Unfortunately, they have dwindled. The physicist caucus has decreased to 1. It is Bill Foster. We just lost Rush Holt. We're getting Rush Holt at the AAAS, so that's really good. And then there was Vern Ehlers, who was a Republican from Michigan, who was a PhD physicist. Unfortunately, we're down to 1. But Bill Foster recently in the Wall Street Journal said he might reconsider, because there is a guy, let me see, I've got his name, Seth Moulton, who got a BS in physics, and he may open up the caucus of physicists to include the BSs, because then they'll have at least 2 in the physics caucus in Congress. There's 1 mathematician, Jerry McInerney, from California, 1 microbiologist, but she only has a master's, and that's Louise Slaughter. Beyond that, last Congress, there were 6 members who had engineering degrees. I think we're about at that this Congress. 25 had medical degrees. Last Congress, 226 law degrees. That's down this, maybe it's a trend, I don't know. It's down to, I think it's 218. I did some looking on that. This one floors people a lot, but there were 22 members who had no degree beyond high school. There were only 20 who had doctoral degrees of any sort. So know your audience, know that Congress is representative of the general population. They didn't go to graduate school or at least get PhDs. A lot of them went to professional graduate school, MBAs, lawyers, lots of those. So the other thing is, since they didn't go and don't really understand science, their expectations about what science can deliver are different. And I like to talk about So it used to be, I would say, that what it comes down to is members of Congress want to know what their investments in science are going to lead to. What will they get? It's gotten worse since 2008 in the fiscal crisis. It's changed more like to how many jobs will science create. Now that's a problem for science, and it's a problem because, as you know, you often can't predict what's going to come from science. I like to show this little cartoon where scientist lifts up the petri dish and runs a $20 bill. You never expected it. So the value is often not immediately known. And while we know it leads to jobs, those jobs come in the long term. So we can look at things like the laser, which at the time it was created was dubbed a solution in search of a problem. The chair of the department told Charlestown he was wasting the department's money. It led to the maser, which led to the laser, which look at what we have and how many jobs result from that, but it didn't happen overnight. Explaining that to members when their culture is one of, I need to be able to go back and tell my constituents what I did for them last year and why it's valuable is difficult. And it's difficult for scientists to transcend that, but I think that's where anecdotes come in. You need to tell those stories, and in your discipline, you always need an anecdote of something that led to something and how it's advancing and helping the general public or society at large. The other thing we deal with these days is there's more and more attacks. This is not new. Politicians who go after grants that may sound funny, sound like they're a waste of taxpayer dollars. You may have heard about shrimp on a treadmill, which had nothing to do with shrimp on a treadmill, by the way. It had to do with studying shrimp in low oxygen environments and the effects of bacteria, which frankly for the shrimp industry is pretty important, given that you have large dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico every spring when all the fertilizer comes out of Mississippi, right? Well, unfortunately, sometimes there are politicians who take advantage of these things and they grandstand. So we've actually been involved at AU in something called the Golden Goose Award, which is the idea of Tennessee Congressman Jim Cooper, who said we need to really fight back and explain how science sometimes, how science really works. And sometimes things you can't predict are really valuable research and they result in amazing things. So we've been involved in this award, which has recognized people like Charlestown's. Last year we gave an award, if you are familiar with the fact that when in hospitals, in the preemie units, it's typical to teach the parents massage, infant massage. That was the research that was based upon was really could have been characterized as rat massage, okay? So you see a member of Congress coming and saying, why are we paying rats to go to the spa? But in fact, it was basically a study of growth hormones where they realized that when you separated the rat pups from the mothers, they weren't growing as fast as they should, and this then sparked what has really saved a lot of money in a lot of infants' lives. So that's one way we're doing that. We're giving it a word. One thing you can do, we need nominees. We need people to tell these stories. They are not easy to find. So we solicit those. I want to conclude though, I want to talk now, we talked some about advocacy, the environment we're in the big picture. So you may have heard that there are two things you never want to see. One is how sausage is made, and the other is how legislation is made. It's a messy process. Right now, what I'd say is the process actually hasn't been working. It looks more like this. In fact, it's so bad, even people in the sausage industry don't want to be affiliated with Congress because they just can't make sausage. At least they're working in a sausage factory to get it done. But our Congress, because of that partisanship that I talked about, and you see this, what some political scientists have concluded is we have a more divided Congress than we've ever had in history, even going back to the Reconstruction era after the Civil War. So what's the result of that? Congress can't pass legislation because they can't agree on anything. And so if we look, the 112th Congress passed 283 laws compared to the 80th Congress, 1947-48, passed 900 public laws. Interesting enough, that was Harry Truman's do-nothing Congress. So if they were do-nothing, we're really in the do-nothing doldrums. The 113th Congress, I haven't done the calculation, but it was on course to far exceed the inability to get things done, even of the 112th. The other problem is the fiscal crisis that we face, and this is something, whether you're interested in science or whether you're just interested in the future of the country, everybody should be an advocate for trying to address the real fiscal challenges we face in a real ways. And one of the problems we have right now is we have one party that says don't increase taxes, and we have another party that says don't touch entitlements, and there's no willingness to compromise. The problem is we have a growing deficit, and we have this growth in entitlements. Entitlements are the things that, of course, the federal government has to pay: Social Security, health care. And if you look historically, you go back, the total spending in 1970 was $900 billion, of which discretionary spending. And discretionary spending is often where science and research and education are funded out of. Was 62% of the budget. Then go to 2012, discretionary is 36% of the budget, and entitlements have basically now taken and reversed and now have about the percentage of that discretionary used to have. But then forecast that out, and this is what gets really scary, is that discretionary goes down to 18% for those things like science, education, mandatory programs, and then the interest on the debt starts to consume things. So something's going to have to be done, and it's only going to come if there's compromise. And we talk about the growing, so there's a growing federal deficit, but there's also a growing innovation deficit. What's the innovation deficit? It's the difference between what we should be spending if we're going to keep up with other countries and not allow them to surpass us in areas such as research and education versus what we actually are spending. And this is a take off this cartoon about something that Norm Augustine, former CEO of Lockheed Martin, says it's like, you know, not funding research is like removing the jet engine from a jet. And this mindless cutting that has come about as a result of the budget caps and what we call sequestration, which will kick in, where it's just across the board cuts, including cuts to defense, is really not healthy, and we need to do something. So just to conclude, why is it important for you to advocate and to learn how to be effective? So tight budgets, and we're not going to see the fiscal challenges get easier anytime soon, and this is not only at the federal level, it's at the state level. It means that there's potential for cuts in science. The new mantra for us is just don't cut us. It used to be we want increases, now just hold it stable and steady for research. You know, there's going to be questions about whether funds have been spent well, and the scientific community and the individuals doing research have to have good answers. And it's not good enough just to say, give us the money, trust us, we've done good things in the past, we'll do good things, and just leave us alone. That won't work in this environment. A new Congress, one thing you learn in my business is it's a constant educational process. You just get somebody who gets it, and they leave, and you start over again. The other thing is you want to defend against and prevent not only bad bills, but regulations. This is an area where oftentimes the scientific community doesn't realize regulations are often the things that are your greatest enemy, and there are opportunities to comment. So advocacy is very broad. Don't think of it, I know I've talked a lot of it in terms of Congress, but it starts locally. It starts with talking it starts just with getting out in the community. It could be giving a talk to high school students, or, you know, it really is broad. It's really trying to show the value of what you do and why it's important to something that you're passionate on, and then going and making a case for it. To help shape, this is really the real reason I think this is most important, is that science brings rationality to the public policy process. Evidence-based decision-making is the best decision-making, and scientists have, and engineers, and people with technical backgrounds, and by the way, I'm not excluding social scientists, because I think they're tremendously important. I will say, I do believe they're actually sometimes worse at making the case of the value of their research than our hard scientists, because I think there's a tendency for people on the Hill to think they understand social science. They had those political science courses, and they can say, well, you know, I went to that course, but it's really not how it works. They understand the grant titles more and think they sound funny. So I think social scientists and behavioralists have a particular challenge in front of them as it means for making the case. But this is social science, all science is vitally important to advancing good decision making. So I also think that scientists underestimate their importance. John Porter said that it was really important that scientists are highly respected. If you look at the Hearst polls, they show that next to firemen, the most prestigious career that people look at and still respect are scientists. That's a lot better than doctors and lawyers, and probably why they don't like Congress. Yes?
How recent is that? Is that still true?
Still true. The last I checked, I don't want to say I looked last year, but within the last couple of years, it's still been very true. That doesn't mean that there aren't political attacks on certain sectors, and climate change is the one we know. But I think the tendency has been for the scientific community to overestimate the attacks on them, and when in fact there's still a lot of respect for scientists amongst the general public. So here are some useful websites. I'll make sure that Ross has this. You're not going to be able to copy these down, but when it comes to advocacy, these are useful websites on some of these, on how to do this effectively. Again, if you're in a scientific society, it's very possible they have a web page. I've got the pages. BASEB has launched a new advocacy website, so the biologists, for all the biologists in the audience, the American Geophysical Union has an action site. They often do have sites that can help you. And with that, thank you for your attention. I will add one other thing, is that I did write a book on science policy. We have a website. It has, in addition to promoting the book, it also provides internships, fellowships, resources, degree programs in science policy. So that's one resource you should feel free to turn to. The other activity I've been involved in is through AAAS. There's an organization that's been formed of societies, of associations like AAU, AAAS, called Engaging Scientists and Engineers in Policy. And there's a website on the AAAS page that you can get to. And it is also trying to provide resources to people who are interested in particularly science policy. So with that, probably we don't have too much time, and I know we got to get going with our panel, but I take a few questions. Yep.
So you had commented on that when you worked in the congressional office that mail was something that really mattered. And I guess I was wondering if you could kind of elaborate on that, because that's something that that SPAC does as an organization. We go out into rural communities and we participate in educational activities, and we have people out there, both kids and their parents, writing letters to their representatives. And I guess I was just wondering if you could kind of elaborate on what was the most effective method? Do we bundle them all together and send them as a packet, or send them one at a time, or try to get people to sign onto a petition?
So I'll give you my personal view on that. Is individual letters are better. We would get robo letters. In fact, it was fascinating. At some point, we started to get these letters. There were about 4 or 5 different versions. They were designed to look personal, but they were being instigated by a major defense contractor who was asking people to write from the district letters. And so that was pretty transparent. So they weren't as effective as somebody who took and hand wrote and penned a note, and it came from their home address. Petitions, we would try and respond, but it's easy to get a lot of people to sign a petition. I don't want to say it's not effective, but it's the individual, really, again, the personal notes. Why does this matter to me? Why did NIH funding get doubled? It was not necessarily because the research community says it was important. It was because of the disease groups and the individuals who had personal stories. And I have seen, it's fascinating to me to go to a defense hearing, and then half the witnesses before the public witness appropriations are people, the Juvenile Diabetes Foundation, with the, because they're funding medical research out of DoD. So the personal piece, so I would say letters are really important, personal contacts are really important, and the more personal it can be, the better. So think of that as the guide. Any other questions? Okay.